The sun hung high over the quiet suburban streets of Riverside, California, as 10-year-old Lucas pedaled his bike to school. He loved riding through the tree-lined avenues, feeling the breeze rush past his face. His school, Oakwood Elementary, sat on the corner of a bustling intersection, its brick walls holding countless stories of childhood adventures. But for Lucas, school had become a place of quiet suffering. Every day, as lunchtime rolled around, Lucas would sit at the long cafeteria table, unzipping his backpack to retrieve his neatly packed meal. A peanut butter and jelly sandwich, an apple, a juice box. His father, Jake, always made sure he had something nutritious. But just as he was about to take his first bite, the same thing happened. "Lucas," came the stern voice of Mrs. Whitaker, his fifth-grade teacher. She was a tall woman with sharp features and an ever-present frown. "You know the rule. Give it here." Lucas had learned long ago not to argue. He didn't understand why she did it, but she always took his lunch, claiming it was against school policy to bring homemade food. He had seen other kids eating their lunches from home, yet he never saw her take theirs. He never told anyone, not even his dad. His father worked long shifts at the car repair shop, and Lucas didn't want to add to his stress. Day after day, his stomach rumbled through afternoon lessons, and he walked home in silence, pretending nothing was wrong, until one day his father noticed. "Lucas, buddy," Jake said one evening as they sat on the couch watching an old sci-fi movie, "you've been looking tired lately. You eating enough at school?" Lucas hesitated. He wanted to tell the truth, but he was afraid. What if he got in trouble? What if Mrs. Whitaker made things worse? But his father's warm, steady gaze gave him the courage he needed. "Mrs. Whitaker takes my lunch," he mumbled. Jake sat up straighter. "She what?" "She says it's not allowed," Lucas said, twisting his fingers together. "I don't know why." A deep frown crossed Jake's face, but he didn't say much. Instead, he pulled his son into a hug and ruffled his hair. "Don't worry about it, kiddo. I'll take care of it." The next morning, Jake woke up earlier than usual. He packed Lucas's lunch, but this time he added something extra, a small recording device neatly tucked into the lining of the backpack. At school, lunchtime came, and once again, Mrs. Whitaker approached. "Lucas," she said, holding out her hand. With a sinking heart, he handed over his lunch. She took it without hesitation, tucking it into her desk drawer. Lucas sighed and tried to ignore the hunger gnawing at his stomach. But that evening, when he got home, his father was waiting with his laptop open. The recording played back the entire incident. Mrs. Whitaker taking the lunch, then opening her desk to reveal several other packed lunches inside. She muttered something about needing them more than the kids did. Jake wasted no time. He marched into the principal's office the next morning with the evidence. Principal Holloway, a kind but no-nonsense woman, listened carefully. Her expression darkened as she watched the footage. "This is unacceptable," she said. By lunchtime, Mrs. Whitaker was called into the office. She never returned to classroom. The students whispered in hushed voices as a substitute teacher took over. Nobody knew exactly what happened to her, but the rumor was that she had been stealing lunches for months. From that day on, Lucas enjoyed his meals in peace. His father still packed his lunch every morning, but now it came with an extra note, a little message scribbled on a napkin. "Proud of you, kiddo. Always speak up." And Lucas never forgot it. The days that followed were different for Lucas. For the first time in months, he could sit at the cafeteria table without fear of his lunch being taken away. He could finally enjoy the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, the crisp apple, and the cold juice box his father packed for him every morning. But more than that, he felt something new, relief. He hadn't realized how much weight he had been carrying on his small shoulders until it was gone. Despite the change, a strange unease lingered in the air at Oakwood Elementary. The students whispered about Mrs. Whitaker's sudden disappearance. Some kids claimed she had been fired. Others said she had been arrested. The truth was never made public, and the school staff quickly moved on as if nothing had happened. A substitute teacher, Mrs. Daniels, took over the class. She was kind and patient, but Lucas could tell she was still finding her footing. One afternoon, as Lucas packed up his books at the end of the day, he heard a voice behind him. "Hey, Lucas." He turned to see Mark, one of the bigger kids in class. Mark was the type of kid who always had something to say, usually loud and full of confidence. "Yeah," Lucas asked, stuffing his notebook into his backpack. Mark glanced around, then lowered his voice. "That thing with Mrs. Whitaker, was it true?" Lucas hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to say. "I heard she took your lunch," Mark continued. "Did she take mine too?" Lucas frowned. He had never seen Mrs. Whitaker take Mark's lunch. He shook his head. "I don't think so." Mark's face darkened. "Then why just yours?" That was a question Lucas had been asking himself too. There were plenty of kids who brought food from home. Why had Mrs. Whitaker singled him out? Later that night, as Lucas sat at the dinner table with his father, he finally voiced a question that had been nagging at him. "Dad, why do you think she only took my lunch?" Jake looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing. He set down his fork and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I've been thinking about that too, buddy," he admitted. "And I don't have an answer yet, but I'm going to find out." Lucas trusted his father. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was him. The next day, after dropping Lucas off at school, Jake decided to do some digging. He started with the school district office, where he requested to see any previous complaints about Mrs. Whitaker. At first, the receptionist was hesitant, but after some persistence, she directed him to a file. As Jake flipped through the documents, a pattern emerged. Mrs. Whitaker had been accused of strange behavior before. A few parents had reported missing lunches, and some had even claimed she treated certain students unfairly. But nothing had ever been done. The complaints were dismissed or quietly ignored. Jake's gut told him there was more to the story. He decided to go a step further. Using some contacts he had in the community, he found out where Mrs. Whitaker lived. Her house was a small, worn-down bungalow on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains. Something about the place felt sad. That evening, Jake sat down with Lucas again. "I found out a little more about Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully. Lucas perked up. "Really? What?" Jake sighed. "She's had a hard life. She lives alone, and it looks like she's been struggling for a while." Lucas frowned. "You mean she took my lunch because she needed food?" Jake nodded slowly. "Maybe, but that doesn't make it right. If she needed help, she should have asked." Lucas thought about it for a long time. He had spent so many months feeling angry and helpless. But now, there was something else mixed in: pity. He didn't like what Mrs. Whitaker had done, but knowing she had been struggling made it harder to stay mad. A week later, Lucas had an idea. He took some money he had saved from his birthday and asked his dad to take him to the grocery store. Together, they picked out food, canned goods, bread, peanut butter, and some fresh fruit. Then they drove to Mrs. Whitaker's house. Lucas felt nervous as he walked up to the door, holding the bag of groceries. He knocked hesitantly. The door creaked open, and there she was, Mrs. Whitaker. But she didn't look like the strict, intimidating teacher he had known. She looked tired. Her face was thinner, and her eyes were filled with something Lucas couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucas held out the bag. "I thought maybe you could use this." Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened. Her lips trembled. "Lucas, She stopped, swallowing hard. "Thank you." It was a simple moment, but it changed something in both of them. Mrs. Whitaker never returned to teaching, and Lucas never fully forgot the way she had made him feel. But he also never forgot the look on her face when she took the groceries. Life moved on. Lucas finished the school year, made new friends, and grew stronger from the experience. His father continued packing his lunch every morning, and every now and then he'd slip in an extra sandwich, just in case someone else needed Aida as the months passed. Lucas began to settle back into a normal routine at Oakwood Elementary. The incident with Mrs. Whitaker slowly faded into the background, replaced by new class projects, field trips, and afternoons spent riding his bike through the California sunshine. But something inside him had changed. For the first time, he realized that sometimes people do bad things not because they're bad, but because they are hurting. It didn't make what Mrs. Whitaker had done right, but it made Lucas think about the world differently. One day, as he sat at the cafeteria table eating his lunch, he noticed a girl sitting a few seats away from him. Her name was Emily, and she was quiet, quieter than most of the kids in class. He had never really spoken to her before, but something about the way she stared down at her empty lunch tray made him pause. Lucas glanced at the second sandwich his dad had packed, the one he had started bringing every day, just in case. Without a word, he slid across the table toward her. Emily looked up, startled. "I already ate one," Lucas said, offering a small smile. "You want it?" She hesitated for a moment, then took it with a grateful nod. "Thanks," she mumbled. From that day on, Lucas started noticing things he hadn't before. He noticed the kids who always ate the free school lunch, their portions smaller than everyone else's. He noticed the ones who never brought snacks for recess or whose clothes looked a little more worn than the rest. And so, without making a big deal of it, he started sharing. Sometimes it was an extra sandwich. Other times, it was an apple or a granola bar. One afternoon after school, he told his dad about Emily and the others he had seen. Jake listened carefully, nodding. Then, after a moment of thought, he said, "You know, buddy, we could do more than just share a sandwich. What if we helped more kids?" Lucas's eyes lit up. "Like how?" Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "Well, what if we started something? A food drive, maybe? Something small at first, just to help the kids who might not have enough to eat at home." The idea stuck. The next day, Lucas and his dad went to the principal's office to ask if they could start a small food donation program at the school. Principal Holloway was impressed by Lucas's thoughtfulness. "We can set up a donation box in the cafeteria," she said. "Students and teachers can drop off extra food, and we'll make sure it gets to the kids who need it." A week later, the box was placed near the cafeteria doors, and a small sign was taped above it. Lucas's lunchbox. "Take what you need. Leave what you can." At first, only a few people donated, mostly teachers and a handful of parents who heard about it. But then something amazing happened. More and more kids started adding snacks, sandwiches, and fruit. Even the local grocery store got involved, donating boxes of granola bars and juice pouches. One day, as Lucas walked past the box, he noticed Emily standing nearby, holding a small pack of crackers. She saw him watching and gave a shy smile. "I put these in," she said, "since you shared with me." Lucas grinned. "That's awesome." By the end of the school year, the food drive had grown beyond anything Lucas had expected. The school decided to make it a permanent program, and even after Lucas moved on to middle school, Lucas's lunchbox remained at Oakwood Elementary, helping students who needed it. One afternoon, as he and his dad sat on the front porch, Jake nudged him playfully. "Pretty crazy how things turned out, huh?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah, all because of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich." Jake chuckled. Funny how small things can make a big difference. And as Lucas watched the sun set over the California hills, he realized his dad was right. Sometimes the smallest actions, standing up for yourself, helping someone in need, sharing what you have, could change the world in ways you never expected. As Lucas moved on to middle school, life kept moving forward, but the lessons he had learned stayed with him. He didn't talk about Mrs. Whitaker much anymore, but every time he walked past Oakwood Elementary, he couldn't help but glance at the cafeteria window and wonder if the food box was still there. Middle school was bigger, louder, and more chaotic than elementary school. There were new teachers, new classmates, and a lot more homework. At first, Lucas wasn't sure how he fit into it all. But then, something familiar caught his attention. There were still kids sitting at lunch tables with nothing in front of them. Some of them tried to act like they weren't hungry. But Lucas knew better. He had been that kid once. One afternoon, after school, he told his dad about what he had noticed. "I don't get it," he said. "Why doesn't anyone do something?" Jake sighed as he tightened a bolt on a car engine. Sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them, and sometimes they do see it, but they don't know how to help. Lucas thought about that for a long time. He didn't want to just notice the problem. He wanted to fix it. The next morning, he talked to the school counselor, Ms. Reynolds. She was one of those teachers who actually listened, and when Lucas told her about the food box at his old school, her eyes lit up. "That's an incredible idea," she said. Would you be interested in helping set up something similar here? Lucas didn't even have to think about it. Yes. Within a few weeks, Lunchbox 2.0 was launched in the middle school cafeteria. This time, it wasn't just a small donation box. Ms. Reynolds helped connect with local food banks and grocery stores to bring in fresh fruits, protein bars, and small meals for students who needed them. Teachers and parents started contributing, and soon, students were quietly grabbing what they needed, no questions asked. One day, as Lucas was refilling the box, a boy from his math class walked up. His name was David, and he was one of the quiet kids, always sitting in the back, always keeping to himself. "Hey," David said, shifting awkwardly. "You're the one who started this, right?" Lucas nodded. "Yeah." David hesitated, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small pack of trail mix. "I don't have a lot, but I wanted to give something back." Lucas grinned. "That's awesome. Thanks, man." David nodded quickly, stuffing his hands in his pockets before walking away. Lucas watched him go, feeling something warm settle in his chest. As the months went by, the food program grew bigger than he ever imagined. The principal invited Lucas to speak at a school board meeting about expanding it to other schools in the district. At first, the idea of standing in front of a room full of adults made him nervous, but his dad gave him a reassuring clap on the shoulder. "Just tell him the truth," Jake said. "Tell him why you started it." So Lucas did. He told him about Mrs. Whitaker, about how it felt to have his lunch taken, and about how he had realized that some kids weren't just having their food taken. They never had any to begin with. By the time he finished speaking, the room was silent. Then, one by one, the board members started nodding. Within a few weeks, the lunchbox program was officially approved for multiple schools. By the time Lucas reached high school, he was known as the kid who started something big. He still packed an extra sandwich every morning, just in case. He still kept an eye out for the kids who sat alone at lunch, making sure they had something to eat. And no matter how busy life got, he never forgot where it all started, with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a teacher who made the wrong choices. One afternoon, years later, Lucas was walking home when he saw a familiar face sitting on a park bench. Mrs. Whitaker. She looked different, older, maybe a little thinner, but there was something softer about her now. She saw him approaching and gave a small, hesitant smile. "Lucas," she said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lucas sat down beside her. "Hi." She looked down at her hands. "I heard about what you've been doing, the food program." Lucas nodded. After a pause, she swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for what I did to you." Lucas studied her face. She looked truly sorry. And maybe, just maybe, she had changed. "I forgive you," he said simply. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she let out a small, shaky breath. They sat there in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the California hills. Before he left, Lucas reached into his backpack and pulled out a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly. He placed it on the bench beside her. "Just in case," he said. Then he walked away, leaving the past behind but carrying its lessons forward, knowing that even the smallest actions could change someone's world. Years passed, and Lucas grew into a young man with a purpose. His experiences at Oakwood Elementary, middle school, and that moment with Mrs. Whitaker shaped him in ways he never expected. By the time he reached his final year of high school, the lunchbox program had expanded beyond his district. Schools across California had adopted the idea, setting up food stations where students in need could take what they needed without fear or shame. Lucas had become somewhat of a local figure. News outlets picked up his story, calling him the kid who made lunch matter. College scholarships started rolling in, but Lucas wasn't sure what he wanted to do next. His heart was in helping others, but he didn't know where that would lead him. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table filling out college applications, Jake walked in, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've been staring at that paper for an hour," his dad said, sitting across from him. "What's on your mind?" Lucas sighed. "I don't know what to put for my major. I don't want to just sit in an office all day." Jake smirked. "Then don't. Do what matters to you." That night, Lucas stayed up researching. He read about social work, nonprofit management, community outreach programs. By the time the sun rose, he had made his decision. A year later, Lucas left for college in Los Angeles, majoring in social entrepreneurship. He wanted to take the Lunchbox program further, beyond just schools. He wanted to create something bigger, something permanent. And he did. By the time he was 25, Lucas had launched the Lunchbox Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting food insecurity among children and low-income families. What started as a single donation box in his elementary school cafeteria had grown into a statewide effort. He partnered with grocery stores, restaurants, and community centers to provide meals, not just in schools, but in shelters and after-school programs. One day, as he prepared to give a speech at a charity event in San Diego, a volunteer handed him a letter. "This came in the mail for you," she said with a smile. Lucas unfolded the paper, his breath catching as he read the first line. "Dear Lucas, I don't know if you remember me, but I was in your 5th grade class. My name is Emily. You were the first person who ever noticed that I didn't have lunch. You probably don't think about it much, but that sandwich you gave me all those years ago meant everything to me." Lucas's throat tightened as he read on. Emily wrote about how she had struggled growing up, how her family barely had enough to eat. But after receiving help through the Lunchbox program, she had decided to pursue a career in nutrition and food security. She was now working with a food bank in Northern California, helping families just like hers. "You changed my life, Lucas," the letter concluded, "and now I want to do the same for others. Thank you." Lucas folded the letter carefully, staring out at the California coastline. His dad had been right all those years ago. The smallest actions, standing up for yourself, helping someone in need, sharing what you have, really could change the world. Over the next few years, the Lunchbox Foundation grew beyond anything Lucas had imagined. What started as a small idea in an elementary school cafeteria was now a movement, reaching children and families across the country. With partnerships from major grocery chains, restaurants, and even government programs, food security for students was becoming a priority in a way it had never been before. Lucas found himself traveling constantly, meeting with school administrators, lawmakers, and nonprofit leaders. His story had become an inspiration, but he never forgot the reason he started it all. The kids. The ones like him. The ones like Emily. One evening, Lucas received a call that took him by surprise. "Mr. Carter?" A familiar voice said on the other end, "This is Mrs. Whitaker." Lucas hadn't heard from her in years, not since their last encounter on the park bench. He straightened in his chair. "Mrs. Whitaker, it's been a while." "Yes, it has," she said softly. "I've been following your work. You've done something truly remarkable, Lucas." Lucas didn't know what to say. The memory of the frightened little boy he had once been, the boy who had watched her take his lunch every day, still lived somewhere deep inside him. But so did the memory of the older, broken woman he had met on that bench. "I wanted to tell you that I'm working now," she continued, "at a community center in Oakland. We run a food pantry, and we serve meals to low-income families. It's not much, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to make things right." A long pause stretched between them. Finally, Lucas exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's really good to hear." Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, then said, "I never apologized properly for what I did to you, Lucas. I don't expect you to forget, but I want you to know that I regret it every single day." Lucas had made peace with the past a long time ago, but hearing her say the words still meant something. "I forgave you a long time ago," he told her. Mrs. Whitaker let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. After they hung up, Lucas sat in silence for a while, staring at the city lights outside his office window. Life had a strange way of coming full circle. A few weeks later, he found himself back in his hometown, visiting Oakwood Elementary for a special event. The school had invited him back to dedicate a new cafeteria space named in honor of the Lunchbox program. As he walked through the hallways, memories flooded back. His old classroom, the lunch tables, the exact spot where Mrs. Whitaker used to stand. But things were different now. The school had a fully stocked food pantry. Every student had access to breakfast and lunch, no questions asked. Kids weren't going hungry anymore, and no one was afraid of their food being taken from them. During the ceremony, Lucas stood in front of a crowd of students, teachers, and parents, his heart full as he looked at the young faces before him. "When I was your age," he said, "I sat in this very cafeteria and felt like I didn't matter. But I want you all to know that you do matter. Your stories matter. And no matter where you come from or what you're going through, you're never alone." The students clapped, and Lucas felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the California sunshine. Later that day, as he walked past the cafeteria one last time, he noticed something taped to the wall. It was a simple sign, handwritten by one of the students. "Take what you need. Leave what you can. We're in this together." Lucas smiled. It was proof that even the smallest act, sharing a sandwich, standing up for yourself, helping one person at a time, could grow into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. And his story was far from over. And Lucas wasn't done yet.